The first sun was sung long before the dawn of humanity. Wolves howl to the members of the pack to show their affection, to scare off other wolf packs, or simply to inform about their location, to say we are here. Whales communicate with each other via songs. They also learn songs from each other. They can sing together, repeating the same phrase one after another. You can disagree with it for sure, but maybe you do not even need a living creature to create a sun, just a wandering wind. So it is easy to believe that the human species was making their own songs long before civilization emerged. It's said that at least so far we cannot reconstruct them. We can only assume that those songs were somewhat similar to the songs of the native tribes, recorded through the 20th century. But just as the songs of African tribes differ from Native American songs, ancient humanity almost certainly had their own unique sounding, which is probably never meant to be heard again. At the same time, it is not totally lost forever. Archaeologists found flutes that are more than 35,000 years old. It is possible to reconstruct those instruments and play. Most probably we'll never hear any song from the distant past, but the song tradition is alive. It's evolving and flourishing on the basis of the triumph of the modern civilization, so parts of the forgotten songs are dissolved in the songs you are listening to today, although sometimes it's hard to say how exactly we get from that to something like that. The Hurrian hymn to Nikkal is the oldest known survived, almost completely, piece of music. It comes from the collection of 36 hymns dated somewhat between 1200 and 1400 BC, an ancient compilation album. Most of the hymns survived partially, but track number 6 was the lucky one. Still, we do not know for sure how the melody was sounding, but we've got a number of pretty similar reconstructions. It is worse with the text, but nowadays there is a convincing translation and even some understanding about how to pronounce it. So, what do we know about the alien world it comes from? Ugarit was a kingdom that was founded 6000 years BC in territory of modern Syria. It had a seaport for trade and fishing, wood, which was extremely valuable because the lands around Ugarit are mostly deserts. Ugarit people had their own alphabet, and they used cheap and reliable clay tablets to write on, although heavier than paper, but still portable and also reusable. There was a sophisticated religion. They had their own kings, which mostly were dependent on Egypt, but still those kings were friends of gods. They had their own army and their own palace, fortress of 6,500 square meters, 2 floors, pool, expensive decorations, administrative courtyards, throne room, garden, burial chambers for dead, and water supply for alive. Ugarit was thriving at the time this song was in use, although the song itself is pretty sad.
It's about a young girl who is quite sad because she cannot have any babies. So therefore she goes at night to worship the goddess Nikkal, who is the goddess of the moon, and she gives some offerings of sesame, shamshame, in Hurrian, and she songs this about all this. She thinks she has sinned and asks for forgiveness.
The last two phrases of the song could be translated as "but the begetter will cry out, she has not borne any child." And in the final line, the childless woman asks, "Why have not I, as a true wife, borne children for you?" This grief causes sympathy even though the verse was written more than 3,000 years ago. But why does the music sound so alienish? Maybe it was an imitation of a song thrush singing. You cannot take it to the bank, but similarity between song thrush singing and the melody is sometimes frightening. So maybe an ancient composer used the bird singing for inspiration. The truth is, we do not know, and probably never gonna know, since Ugarit civilization was completely destroyed at once. Between 1200 and 1150 BC, something happened that is called Late Bronze Age collapse. Almost all countries of the region of the time were destroyed or severely weakened. There is no consensus as to the reason for the process, but as for Ugarit people, it was a sudden invasion of so-called Sea people, probably the union of migrating tribes. The Ugarit army was in Hittite land for unknown reason, and the kingdom was completely defenseless. We know that for sure, because there is a letter from Ugarit king Amurapi to Egypt in which he describes the desperate situation. Ugarit city was completely destroyed by the invaders, never rebuilt and abandoned. Just imagine a woman who's singing in an empty palace chamber, while invaders smash and rob luxurious halls. At the times when Ugarit was gaining its power, approximately 1800 BC, miles and miles away in the Indian subcontinent, Harappan or Indus Valley civilization was dying. Their sophisticated religion was vanishing, their perfect planned cities were depopulated, and language was forgotten. The lands of the disappearing civilization were inherited by rather warlike Indo-Aryan tribes. They had no cities, no central government, no or practically no writing, and yet they were calling themselves Aryan, which means superior or noble. But they've got something very special which prevented them from vanishing, unlike Ugarit or Harappan civilization. The Vedas. Generally, the word Veda is translated as knowledge. In fact, the Vedas were the collection of texts which were transferred from person to person orally. All the content, and it is pretty extensive, was meant to be learned by heart. What you've just listened to comes from the Samaveda, or Veda of songs. The earliest parts of Samaveda are dated around 1800 BC, but the latest estimated date of when it became full is approximately 1000 BC. Even after the Vedas were at last written down, it was believed that texts should be transferred only orally to preserve the phonetics and secret meanings which cannot be contained by dead letters. That's where the trick comes in. In Vedic Sanskrit, language of Samaveda, accent or tone called swara is extremely important.
Vedic swara was critically important as the meaning of a richa or mantra changed with any incorrect use of swara. Thus, it is imperative that the mantras are chanted in the designated, precise swaras. Scholars and students of Vedas adhere to this tradition rigorously even today. These Vedic swaras gradually developed into 7 musical notes in the singing tradition of Samaveda.
So the melodies of the Samaveda are kinda diffused into the text. That is the way to preserve songs sounding closely to the initial origin. Most probably the modern sounding of the Samaveda differs from the ancient sounding. Even nowadays there are 3 different schools which do not agree with each other on how to sing it properly. But that is definitely not because of the lack of trying. And still, that is not only psalms, which was sung generations and generations, even thousands of years ago, not only psalms which can be sung today and translated, but they are in use and extremely important till the very day. Modern hitmakers cannot even dream about such fame. Musical part of the Samaveda is kinda notated, since there is a special way to sing each sound, but of course it's not totally reliable. And that is a common plague of ancient songs and musical pieces: no well-readable musical notation system and no notated music as the result. For example, we have an ancient Sumerian hymn to Ninkasi. She is a goddess of beer. This hymn is a poetic beer recipe dated the 19th century BC. We can read and translate the text, so you can even make the Sumerian beer, and a lot of people are actually doing it. So we know the taste of the song, but the melody we can only imagine. Another example, it is known that epics written by Homer, the late 8th century BC, were originally meant to be sung. Those epics are fascinating even today, and many of the themes used by Homer still have a representation in modern pop culture.
My son. Father.
Son.
Dad.
And I'm your dad, Peter.
I am your father.
Homer's epics still live in our culture, but we can only guess how it was performed originally.
Κι ανθρώπων γνώρισε πολλών τους τόπους και τη γνώμη και έπαθε πλήθος φορές τα πέλαγα.
One more example, the Chinese Book of Songs, or Jing, contains 305 of them dated between the 11th and the 7th century BC. Reportedly, the compilation was made by Confucius. It is full of magnificent poems, but
original tunes for singing the songs were lost by the 3rd century at the latest. And only in the 13th century, an authoritative score of the songs became commonly available.
This song is a love poem about a young man pursuing a beautiful lady.
perhaps the melody is authentic, perhaps it's not, we do not know. In the worst case, it is written 2000 years after the lyrics. but in that case it is still about 8 centuries old for us. And there was one ancient society that was obsessed with the music. They were playing music at their parties, at religious ceremonies, in theaters, and the guy named Hurrian reportedly once played a flute while riding a dolphin.
Every free Greek person had to play the lyre, and they had to play in the symposia as well. This was the rule for the ancient Greeks. Everybody had to play a song with his lyre.
At first glance, such love for music and singing may seem strange, but the ancient Greek person could only hear a song if somebody was singing, and to hear a specific and exact piece of music it should be written down and then played. So they've invented a way to write down the music using abstract symbols, actually even 2 ways.
A vocal one and an instrumental one. The vocal one, the vocal notation, was with letters as symbols of the notes.
Since we can make the exact replicas of the musical instruments and we have notation and we know for sure how to pronounce ancient Greek words, we can reproduce their songs precisely with almost no room for misinterpretation. It's like listening to a 20-25 century old tape, so let's listen to some. It is a Greek tragedy written by Euripides, a dramaturg who lived in the 5th century BC, and he was so incredibly popular that his plays are still on stages all over the world. In his plays, gods were often erotic and influenced, and slaves often were depicted like human beings with their own characters and feelings. For those steps away from ancient playwriting standards, he was not in a huge favor of critics, but he wasn't breaking all the rules. For example, each tragedy of the time ought to have Stasismon, a special choral order, which was performed in the middle of the play. That is the fragment of such order, written most probably by Euripides himself for the tragedy Orestes.
Orestes! What are you waiting for?
Even without understanding a word, you are probably ready to bet that the lyrics are incredibly depressive and grim, and it is so.
Κατέκλυσεν δίνον πόνον.
And that is the first Delphic hymn to Apollo, which was written by Athenaeus, son of Athenaeus, at 128 BC. That wasn't just a usual song to sing every day, that was a religious hymn for a very special religious event, Pythides. Those Pythides were happening only when a lightning was spotted over the armor top of the Parnes mountain by specially dedicated watchers placed at the altar of Zeus Astrapaios in Athens at least once of 9 specific days and nights in spring, but it was happening more often than could be expected. Historians are finding in the text references to the political struggles of the time, and musicologists having fun while comparing its structure to other hymns, including early Christian ones. But for modern listener, it's just a praise to Apollo. It is the oldest song with words and musical notation that survived fully, and it was an epitaph written on the tombstone. It was definitely created by a man named Seikilos. We know that for sure, since there are words on it. I'm a tombstone, an image. Seikilos placed me here as a long-lasting sign of deathness and remembrance. But we do not know who was lying under the tombstone. There is a theory that it was the Seikilos' wife named Eutorpe, but that's just a theory. The tombstone originates most probably from the town of Tralles, nowadays Aydin, or its neighborhood, and it's dated pretty loosely the 1st or the 2nd century of the current era. And also we have the words of the epitaph itself.
While life lasts, shine bright, don't let anything you benight. We don't have life for long, my friend. To all our plans, time decrees an end. Musically, that makes sense to us because it has a certain idiom whereby when it's cheerful, it goes up. And when it's less cheerful, night, there's that fall. Time decrees an end. There's that fall at the end as well.
Basically, that is everything we know about it, except that is a really nice little song with a powerful message. While hearing stories like that, it is easy to start to think about ancient times like about good times. But it wasn't. For example, by the beginning of the current era, Hellenistic Greece was conquered by the mighty Roman Empire, and that empire was militaristic, violent, traditionalistic to the degree of feeding large wild cats with Christians and criminals. And its economy was built on the grounds of slavery. In the 2nd century it was all true, but on the other hand things were slowly getting better. From 96 to 180 Rome was ruled by good emperors. They were caring not only about the power of Rome or about their own wealth, but also about their subjects. Killing a slave became the same crime as killing a free man, a lot of slaves of the government were set free, new laws were implemented to encourage owners to free their slaves. One man, Mesomedes of Crete, was not only freed by the Emperor Hadrian, but also awarded with a state salary. That's because he was a talented poet and a hymn writer. Actually, he was set free after writing a beautiful hymn to one young man named Antinous, who definitely deserves some description. The lover of the emperor, Antinous, was proclaimed a god after drowning in the Nile under suspicious circumstances. Possibly it was a suicide to avoid the parting with Hadrian. This romantic story is a source of inspiration for generations of artists, even nowadays. Unfortunately, one of the first works about Antinous, the hymn by Mesomedes, hadn't survived, but some other stuff had. Four hymns by Mesomedes are known with the original tunes. Two of them, Hymn to the Muse and Hymn to the Calliope and Apollo, are both short and similar. And that is the hymn to the sun. It is kinda interesting to listen to, especially knowing that that is the music that the Emperor of Rome was listening to. And that is the hymn to Nemesis, the goddess who was coming to bad-behaving Romans to punish them with the whip and sometimes with the dagger. All the hymns by Mesomedes are pretty straightforward descriptions of the divine subject with the exaggerated praise. Yet the time of the gods was running out. Neither old gods like Apollo or Zeus, nor new ones like Antinous could successfully compete with Jesus. The god who was carpenting, saving ordinary people during the storm, healing and feeding them, making wine out of water, drinking this wine with publicans and sinners. He was the god of ordinary people, and ordinary people usually outnumber everybody else. So, starting from here, hymns are dedicated to the new and only god. Of course, not all the people around were happy about the new religion. There are some known cases when Roman authorities were protecting Christians from attacks by angry mobs, but usually the government was persecuting Christians. After the last good emperor died, the Roman Empire started to suffer almost permanently of political instability, epidemics, and not extremely successful wars. At the same time, almost for a century, despite many efforts of the Roman authorities, Christian Church was gaining more and more followers. By the year 300, 10% of the world's population were Christians. It was more or less so until the reign of the Emperor Diocletian. He finally put an end to the political and economical chaos in the empire, but he also started the most severe persecutions of Christians ever known, named by historians as the Great or Diocletianic persecutions. Saint George, for example, was beheaded by the order of Diocletian after multiple unsuccessful attempts to torture him to death, or at least to a renunciation of faith. And he wasn't the only victim. A lot of martyred saints are known from that period, and for sure there are a lot of victims we do not know. But because of that piece of parchment, we have an idea what they was sinning. That is the earliest Christian hymn ever known. Sadly enough, only a small part survived, but it is enough to reconstruct it, especially the melody. This hymn is much more lucky. Text and music are known fully. Phos Hilaron is the Christian hymn that was written likely at the end of the 3rd century or beginning of the 4th. But some are saying that it was written by Saint Basil, who died in 379, and it seems that Saint Basil believed that it was composed by Saint Athenagoras, who was probably beheaded in 305. It is the oldest known Christian hymn that is still in use, although mostly translated to more modern versions. And unlike chants from Samaveda, we perfectly know the melody. It is interesting also to compare the text of Phos Hilaron with the text of Hymn to the Sun by Mesomedes. Both of them are about fathers, immortality, sun, joyful singing, and the world we are living in. Maybe old gods were dead, but the old musical tradition was alive. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the 6th century, medieval times started, the new chapter of history, including the history of songs. But it doesn't mean that the story of ancient and classical songs has ended. Archaeologists are finding new artifacts. Musicians and historians are trying to reconstruct the ancient sounding.
This is ancient Greek music as we think it was actually sung around 400 BC.
Composers are making epic and beautiful covers of ancient songs. Some are reimagining the ancient music and creating the authentic sounding tunes for ancient texts. And others are creating new, wonderful songs on the basis of the ancient tradition.
Would you please stop breathing for the rest of this evening?
The music is not forgotten, it is also passed on to new generations.
Of course, can also be combined.
But there is another reason why the history of songs, even those far away in time songs, is alive. They are telling the story about people who were gathering together to praise the Lord. That is the story about a man who wrote a song for his beloved departed, and about an average theatre-goer and the great play, and about people teaching their children to sing songs of their grandparents, and about the childless woman who was playing her lyre while listening to birds. That is not about emperors and battles. History of songs is the history of the people that will sing in them, same people as around you in many ways, but some lived thousands years ago. He was the god of ordinary Hermes. I've told you there is no part for you in this video. Give the ram to Jesus and get lost.